Welcome to a new episode of AKIO TV, and today I'll be explaining how a nuclear power plant works. A nuclear power plant basically consists out of three sections. The first section is responsible for generating energy. The second section is responsible for turning that energy into electricity, and the third section is responsible for cooling the power plant. Let's take a look at the nuclear reactor, the first section first. The nuclear reactor is basically a pressurized tank of water with rods of uranium inside it. Now, to start a nuclear reactor, the only thing we have to do is fire a bunch of neutrons right into it. So let's take a closer look at the atoms of that uranium and what happens to them when they get hit by those neutrons. So this is a uranium atom, and as you can see, there is a neutron incoming. When a neutron hits the uranium atom, it gets absorbed by that atom, and then the atom gets unstable, so unstable that it falls apart. It's two new neutrons and a lot of heat. Now, obviously, this creates an entire chain reaction of neutrons flying around and new atoms splitting and releasing a lot of heat. Now, because of the billions of atoms that are going to split in this chain reaction, it gets really hot inside the uranium. That heat is then transferred into the surrounding water. So you only have to fire a couple of neutrons at the uranium to start the reaction, and then it'll keep going until it runs out of uranium. The water inside the reactor is going to get really hot, but it won't turn into steam because the pressure is too high. There is simply not enough space for it to turn into steam. That hot water is then going to flow into the heat exchanger. That sounds complicated, but it's basically a tank full of water with a pipe running through it. Now, what's going to happen is that the hot water runs through the pipe, and the pipe runs through a tank full of cold water. So the heat from that hot water is going to be transferred into the surrounding cold water. So the water inside that heat exchanger is going to get really hot, and the water that is flowing through the pipe, the reactor water, is going to cool down and flow back into the reactor. The hot water inside the heat exchanger turns into steam, which then rushes through a couple of turbines. Because of that, the turbines are going to rotate, and they are connected to a power generator, an electrical generator. The electrical generator then generates electricity because it's going to rotate, and there you have it. The power plant generates power. When the steam is passed through those turbines, it goes into yet another heat exchanger. In this heat exchanger, the steam is cooled down so much that it turns back into liquid water, which then goes back into the first heat exchanger, completing the circuit. The water inside the second heat exchanger then obviously heats up. That water then goes into a cooling tower to cool it down, and a cooling tower is quite a clever invention. You see, if you have a bucket full of hot water, it takes quite a long time to cool down, but if you spray hot water through the air, then it cools down pretty quickly. So inside the cooling tower, the hot water is sprayed into the air by a nozzle, and then it drops down all the way to the bottom of the tower. During the time that it drops down, a lot of water evaporates, losing a lot of heat, so it cools down. And when the water has reached the bottom of the tower, it's cold again, and it gets pumped back into the heat exchanger. All of the water that evaporates comes out of the top of the cooling tower, so those thick white clouds that cooling towers produce aren't smoke. It's just evaporated water. It is actually clouds. These cooling towers produce clouds. How cool is that? Some power plants, however, do not have cooling towers. They just pump the hot water back into a river, a lake, or the ocean, and they suck new cold water out of it at the same time to put into the heat exchanger. That is very efficient because you don't need an expensive, huge cooling tower. Now, some people think that the water that is pumped into a river or a lake from a power plant, that they think that the water is radioactive. But it's not, because as you can see, the water that is pumped into a river is completely separate from the water that actually goes through the nuclear reactor. The water that goes through the nuclear part of the plant is completely isolated. Maybe you think nuclear energy is a bad idea, or maybe you think that nuclear energy is a very good idea. Anyway, at least you now know how it works. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.